recording to start. And we are good to go. All right, so hello, welcome to the winter session of the DOE CSER Energy Sector SBOM and HBOM Quarterly Working Group. This is a continuation update of our previous POC meetings with a new title and a new occurrence, kind of meeting cadence to show that we're focused on both SBOMs and HBOMs in the energy sector. Our presenters for today will be two technical researchers from Robert Erbes and Lucas Tate from PNNL and INL. I'll let them kind of introduce themselves a little bit more after the pass off. But thank you all for coming. They're going to give this presentation, and then please feel free to post questions in the chat. We will be kind of having a Q&A at the end. So thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all. And I'm going to pass it off to Robert and Lucas.
Thanks, Catherine. My name is Robert Erbes. I'm a distinguished computer security researcher from Idaho National Laboratory. Give you a little bit of background about my background, just so you kind of know the perspective that I'm coming from as we're giving this this talk, which is going to be about some of the key challenges associated with using SBOMs as we see them. I've got about over 20 years experience doing vulnerability research. So that's primarily looking at computer systems and figuring out how to break into them and then identify mitigations for them. And I've done this primarily for ICS/OT equipment through the Idaho National Lab, but I've also done it for private industry as well. It kind of provided me a lot of experience with regards to the identification of vulnerabilities, doing risk management associated with vulnerabilities and things like that. I'm also one of the co-founders of and the PI for the Citrix program, which is DOE CSER's kind of testing program to help identify really good ways to identify and deal with supply chain risk management inside the energy sector and vulnerabilities therein. And with that, I'll pass to Lucas.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Lucas Tate. I'm a senior data scientist here at PNNL. So I've spent about 10 years as a statistician, data scientist, although for most of us statisticians, we keep our head low since data science pays more. So I've been across the board, started actuarial. I did a stint doing some medical research in Australia. Landed at the lab, and I think I've still been pretty eclectic. So I had the chance to work on the Citrix program, where I'm predominantly responsible for being the recipient of all the bills of materials we collect as part of our research. You'll see me tuning into some of the SBOM working groups, and then a lot of my recent research interests are in converting SBOMs to graphs so that we can do comparisons and get some more utility out of them.
Cool. Well, let's get started. Next slide, please. So the kind of overview of what we're going to be talking about is, obviously bills of materials have existed for a very, very long time. That's in the different kinds of bills of materials. You have HBOMs more traditionally, but now we're starting to get in, well, we've already been doing software bills of materials, and that's primarily what we're talking about here. And software bills and materials in some aspects are relatively mature, but a lot of it has to do with like what we want to use them for. And this specifically is talking about, using SBOMs as an enabling technology for supply chain risk management in the energy sector specifically. So that supply chain risk management piece, even that phrase can mean a lot of different things. So we're going to cover some of that during this talk. And a lot of the talk is based upon and informed by our experience trying to develop BOMs, trying to use BOMs to do supply chain risk management as part of the Citrix program. And just thinking about how is somebody going to be doing this. The Citrix program has been around for about 7 or 8 years now. And we've been working on it. And all of this is informed by that experience. So we've identified several key challenges that we believe actually inhibit using SBOMs specifically at scale for supply chain risk management. And we're basically identifying these things, and we're going to talk about these things as a way of saying like, hey, we need to solve these problems to get both, of course, private industry, national resources like the national labs working on solving these problems so that we can actually effectively use BOMs for supply chain risk management, or at least know where they're not going to work so that we can focus on where they are going to work and do more there. Lucas, anything else to add?
No, that's great. I think, I think there's 7 challenges that we identified in total, depending on who you are and where you're coming from. Some of them may be more or less relevant to the work you do. It's also a really big space. And so, you know, coming up with 7 challenges probably means we missed a lot more. And so once we get into the discussion, if there's certain ones that folks want to flag that they think are significant, it's probably worth talking about. So.
All right. Well, without further ado, we'll get started. Next slide, please. So the first key challenge, so key challenge number 1 that we identified is having to do with CVEs and vulnerabilities. So it's titled, of course, as you can read, associating a CVE with a product does not mean that that product is vulnerable. This is basically looking at something that is essentially well known and common within the vulnerability reporting space. You know, if you have a cert within an organization or a bug bounty program, or you report vulnerabilities, you know, the idea that, hey, there might be a CV associated with some software component, you deal with having to figure out if it actually affects your product or not, if the vulnerability, if it does affect your product, if that actually affects the security of that product in a meaningful way. This is all just kind of normal bread and butter stuff. But as SBOMs become more prevalent, or as they can become more prevalent, as CVEs, you know, as more people get a hold of SBOMs for their software, or software that they're responsible for, or software that they use, and then they're able to do really trivial matching of like, oh, you're using OpenSSL version whatever, therefore you have these 20 vulnerabilities that are applicable to you that you must now patch because you're vulnerable. The reality is that's not how it works at all. Almost every single time, you know, that correlation of, I know I'm using this piece of software and that piece of software has these known vulnerabilities associated with it. That's the very beginning of a journey that can sometimes take a significant amount of time to determine, one, you know, again, if that is actually a vulnerability that applies to you, if that vulnerability applies to part of the code that is actually in the product that you're using. Because of course, with things like open source software or configurable software, you can have vulnerabilities and aspects of the code that have been removed or that have been disabled. And then of course, that last part, which is the most important part, is even if there is a vulnerability in a product, that vulnerability might not affect the actual security of your system. And that happens a lot, like a lot. And if we're going to be generating SBOMs and starting to get this information about what software is in our products to lots and lots of people, and they're going to start to look at, okay, I've got these 15,000 pieces of software, which then correlates to umpteen million vulnerabilities. And now I have to patch all of them. You know, it's going to be a huge amount of wasted time and a wasted effort. So this is not necessarily a new problem. The idea of saying like, hey, I've got a bunch of vulnerabilities and I need to, and I'm identifying them, potential vulnerabilities through SBOMs. You know, that's something that people are aware of. It is both at once a potential source of problems, but also a potential victory in terms of actually helping identify vulnerabilities in products. So it kind of goes both ways. Some notable efforts that are trying to look at addressing this include things like VEX, so vulnerability exchange information, which would allow you to include information about known vulnerabilities or the lack of known vulnerabilities inside of SBOMs as well, or separate from the SBOM itself. Even then, though, there's still like additional problems associated with like saying that vulnerabilities don't exist in a product, so having like negative attestations and things versus positive attestations and things. And as we're thinking about the rest of these key challenges, I want you to continue to be thinking about like this aspect of it for each of them, which is that there are vulnerabilities associated with things. Not all vulnerabilities are applicable. And anytime we're doing anything, most of it in terms of supply chain risk management is a matter of trying to identify the vulnerabilities that we care about and getting them mitigated in one fashion or another. So the fact that not all vulnerabilities are exploitable, not all vulnerabilities are actually applicable, that's going to be true this entire time as we go through this. Lucas, anything else to add?
Nothing for me. I think that's good. So next slide. So this is the second key challenge we identified. So we phrased it as a question: what should be shared between OEMs and asset owners, and how can that be done most effectively? And so I think I've presented this a different way every time I've had the chance. But there's this general assumption that if everyone has SBOMs and everyone shares SBOMs, then security, right? And you know, in practice, I don't know how true that is. And so that's kind of what this activity or this question looks to explore. So, if you think about where SBOMs are generated most effectively, where actions are taken on SBOMs, I think one of the open questions for us is, does it make sense to make this infinitely transparent? Do the actions associated with that SBOM fall on one party or another? And really looking to understand, okay, let's pretend we got everyone in the room, right? Everyone had kind of the agenda of increasing their supply chain security. And there's kind of different theories or models for how that should work. And so one of the things that we think is really important, and shout out to SBOM shout out to Southern Company for their attempt to enumerate a substation. There's a lot of problems you run into, and a lot of non-technical challenges you run into. And so what we kind of propose with this question is looking to understand, what are the models that exist? What ways end up being the most effective when you look at them? And it may surprise us, right? We may find out that SBOMs aren't as useful as we thought, but this activity would look to kind of understand, okay, if you pass it to, if an OEM generates an SBOM, they pass it to the asset owner, then vulnerability management, in practice, does that actually help? Or what are the models that are effective? So that's kind of what this question looks to understand.
And I think to add to that, going back to the who should know what and kind of when and for what purpose, that's a really big question. Because you could say that somebody who produces a product, they can produce an SBOM for that, and they can share that SBOM with their customers. So now their customers have information about like what are the third-party or even first-party components inside of the product that they just bought. And that can be powerful in some cases because you might have some vulnerabilities, such as like Log4j, where any individual who has knowledge that, oh, you use Log4j in this product means that it is likely vulnerable, and you need to take mitigation steps to protect against that. And you might be able to take those mitigation steps outside of a vendor patch for that particular issue. There's other types of vulnerabilities where the vulnerability itself either has some nuance or is something that a customer cannot fix on their own. Or there's not enough information to determine like what are the actual effects. So like you find out that, okay, there's a vulnerability in here, and then your only real, as a customer, you say, okay, I've identified that there might be a vulnerability in this thing, is then your only recourse to go back to the vendor that provided you with the SBOM and say, hey, I identified this vulnerability, what's going on? Well, ideally, the vendor who provided that SBOM to you is already keeping track of that. So what have you really necessarily gained by sharing that SBOM and sharing that information? Like, do you even increase liability if organizations know about vulnerabilities which they cannot do anything about? Are there policies in place within those organizations that mean that if you have a particular severity of vulnerability, you must do things now, when the things that you must do are basically things that are outside of your control in terms of doing mitigation? And again, this all goes on top of the fact that not all vulnerabilities are going to be applicable. Not all vulnerabilities are going to be exploitable, but we are going to start to know about them at a much broader scale. And that's going to have effects. So trying to figure out what goes where, when, how is it useful, what are we actually benefiting from, what are the policies and procedures that we should have with regards to information exchange, and what kind of responsibilities should exist. All right, next challenge. And back to Lucas, I think.
All right, so everyone pull out your word bingo boards. So dealing with the heterogeneity of SBOM. So this is the idea. It's been talked about in a lot of circles. I gave a presentation that kind of touched on this at the SciScrim 24 conference recently, and then immediately MITRE released a document that was way better than mine. But this is kind of, if you have a given piece of software, and we've probably, most of us have seen this, and everyone generates SBOMs against it, and then you try and compare those, there's a lot of differences. And they aren't all differences because people are wrong. That kind of the reality is there's a lot left to interpretation. So whether that's how you define the scope, whether that's how deep you go, whether you're looking at source code, whether you're looking at artifacts, et cetera. And so all of those things mean that, you may have the same name, you may think you're talking about the same software, but when you line those things up and you say, okay, hey, I have, tool A, tool B, these don't look the same. That's a challenge. And it kind of, if the goal is getting towards a future of automation and scalability, those are the sorts of things that can inhibit that. And so the good news is there's, this is a recognized problem. So several folks are looking at it. The SBOM harmonization plugfest over at Carnegie Mellon is working on it. I haven't seen the outputs of that. Maybe some of you have. I think it was kind of a pay to play. You had to bring your SBOMs to get some of the early results on that. And then obviously the MITRE report did a really good job of outlining a lot of those differences in really great detail.
Yeah, I think this goes, it goes further than just having like standards or recommendations, because there's also just a matter of interpretation. Sometimes we have different types of SBOMs due to technical constraints or technical requirements, and I think those can definitely be solved. But the other one is just like, assumptions about what is software and what is not software, assumptions about what type of information is available about software, or even what the structure of software is. So like an SBOM that is generated on a pretty well-established ecosystem, such as like a package manager type system, or maybe some of the like JavaScript frameworks, where you have kind of this surrounding a type of software, you've got a whole set of metadata that is rich with information, and you're already having people like taking things and declaring something as a software package, and then defining what that means, and then adding information about it, like such as versioning or source or that kind of stuff. That's not universally true of all software everywhere. It's definitely not universally true of all software that exists in embedded systems. And so, there are some problems that are really easy to solve, but when you start to combine those easy problems and try to build like a cohesive whole and a bigger knowledge of like everything, because that's ultimately what we're talking about, because nobody's running purely on, PyPy type repositories. There's other types of software other than Python, and other types of Linux systems other than Debian. So as you have to combine and reason about all these things together, again, having different kinds of SBOMs with different kinds of information, with different assumptions made about them as they were being generated by different organizations caring about different things, that just means that you're not going to be able to do what you want to do, or you're going to have to be very careful about how you do it. Next slide. So that kind of gets into the idea of, how do you measure quality or suitability of a software bill of materials? One of the primary things is that, I could generate a SBOM as part of manufacturing that lets me know like what my dependencies are, my third-party dependencies. I'm not necessarily going to, I know what my first-party dependencies are, but so I want to keep track of my third-party dependencies, and I want to keep track of, what versions I'm using. I want to keep track of which open source libraries that I've pulled from. I want to know which ones I've, got my local copies of, things that I've cloned, and that serves a very particular purpose and role. If I were to then take that SBOM and provide it to an external third party that might be doing, say, like vulnerability research, or trying to determine like, okay, given these things, which vulnerabilities are applicable or not, that again kind of starts the conversation, but I cannot just take that SBOM and, having it say OpenSSL version 1 point whatever and tell you whether or not the vulnerabilities associated with that are actually applicable or useful. I need significantly more information, and different kinds of information depending on the specific vulnerability that I'm trying to determine whether or not it is actually effective, or is consequential to you. So the idea that, different types of information that could go into an SBOM will enable you to do different things, and depending on what you want to do, that'll kind of determine what information you need inside that SBOM to actually have that SBOM be useful for your purposes. So there's no just like, oh, I have an SBOM and my problems are solved. It's like, okay, I have an SBOM. Now it's like, well, does that SBOM contain the kind of information that I need to do what I want to do? The second bit has to do with just like overall, again, like quality or overall quality. So if I produce an SBOM and Lucas produces an SBOM of the same thing, we could even start from the same place, depending on how we interpret what's important and what's not important, depending upon our goals, our technical capabilities, all these things, we're going to produce different SBOMs. And they might both be accurate in the sense that neither one it has any incorrect information in it, but they might still have different amounts of information in it, different types of information in it. And how do you evaluate whether or not the person who generated an SBOM, generated it according to the assumptions that you have about the data that you need to use, versus maybe they just didn't care about it. Yeah, so I'll pass that back to Lucas, see if he has anything to add.
Yeah, no, I would point to several efforts that we've probably all seen where, folks generate bombs and, someone always asks. Uh-oh, I lost my mic. So someone always asks, is which bomb's the best? Is it good? And people are really, really good at avoiding that question. I think when you look at some of the quality efforts that are going around, at least from what I've seen, you end up with kind of an acknowledgement that data is present. In some cases where you have more stringent requirements on the content of a string, you can do things like validation and checking. In some cases, depending on your level of sophistication, you may be able to detect that something occurred in a bomb that you don't appreciate, or maybe you're comparing it to a standard like the NTIA minimum elements. And so all of those things give you kind of some level of detail about the quality of a bomb. But I, at least from what I've seen, a lot more work needs done, right? So, an example I would give is, when we look at two bombs and one clearly has a lot more components and more connections, the first question that always comes to my mind is, are those connections real, right? And that turns out to be a really tough thing to answer. I think this is a place that is getting a lot of work. I think it needs a lot more work. And I think having tools for quality and suitability are going to be extremely useful for making SBOMs more actionable moving forward.
And I think this also kind of touches on attestation to a degree. So if I generate an SBOM and I hand it to Lucas, and Lucas says, well, how can I trust that you did a good job? Or how can I trust that you did not make any errors in this? How do I know that it's complete? Those are all different things. And, is Lucas going to have to generate his own SBOM or audit how I did it before we can say, yeah, Robert is a trusted source of SBOM information for this particular thing? That's a very big question. You can assume that people who are manufacturing things know everything about that thing, but of course no system is perfect, and also nobody manufactures absolutely everything by themselves anymore. We're sitting on top of 70 plus years of development of computer technology, of software, and no piece of software stands on its own these days. For every compiled code, you've got the compiler and the people that wrote the compiler and the compiler for that software, and then the operating system underlying it, and all these other bits and pieces. And if you want to go really crazy about the supply chain security aspect of it for software, you have to consider all of it. The entire 70-year plus history, and that gets really difficult. So yes, definitely some good work being done, but there's also just things that we have to be aware of in terms of how we implement and use SBOMs, knowing what we know, knowing what could be done, knowing that there could be errors or might be errors. What are we going to do about those types of errors and all that kind of stuff? It's all just more stuff to think about. Next slide. I think were you gonna take this one on, Lucas, to start?
Yeah. So I always keep this one around, right? Because so I think most folks are aware of the SBOM types. That document came out pretty early, and in a lot of ways, there was a lot of foresight that went into this when you looked at SBOMs at that time. I think when the document came out, there was a lot of conflation between what I would call source bombs and then the build bombs, where you'd have folks just following the package managers and declaring kind of these extrinsic identifiers of software. And then you'd have folks that are crawling file systems and generating intrinsic identifiers. And when you went to compare those BOMs, they were completely different. And for good reason, they were different SBOM types. And so I think we're, at least from my perception, I've seen folks get a pretty good handle on the source and build BOMs. And analyze BOMs, I think of those as kind of an extension on those, where we're trying to detect after the fact. But I have seen infinitely less work towards the tail end about what's happening for deployed BOMs and BOMs at runtime, maybe doing dynamic analysis or however those are implemented. And so this is one where I think it's worth some more thought. Personally, and this is a personal opinion, I still want to see some evidence that all of the types are useful, and not just kind of on a benchtop, but kind of in practice. And so I think that's kind of what I would like to see explored in this key challenge.
Yeah, and I'll add, for me, it's like not just that it's useful, but to understand like what is it useful for? What can we say given a source BOM that we cannot say if we build a BOM at a different time? Another part that this touches on with regards to like runtime or deployed, if you have software that dynamically updates itself at any point in time, is it still the same software? Do you need to have a different BOM based upon the fact that when you installed it, the piece of software looked at the environment it was in and configured itself differently, which might have significant security consequences. And again, if you update anything at any time, that's a different type of software. If you have a system that receives updates, maybe it's not a complete 100% update. Like maybe you maintain a bootloader and you update the application on top of that. Those two things don't exist separately in terms of the device that they're both running on. They both need to be there. And Catherine, we lost video, but you can't. So if you change one of those two things, either the bootloader or the application, then do you need a different BOM for that? And that gets kind of into our next key challenge. But we'll see if we've got video back or.
I am back. Quick internet problems, but I can throw it back up.
And I think you're on the wrong presentation.
I'll let Catherine have it back.
How about are we on to the next one? We're on to 6.
Yep, there we go.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Back to you guys.
All right, so this is, I'll have a quick note and then I'll hand it back off to Lucas. But this is kind of the idea of, you have this SBOM, it was generated at a particular point in time. How long is that valid for? What if things change? How do you account for those changes and that kind of stuff? But Lucas, you take over.
Yeah, so this one is really, this is one I care a lot about, but it's also really hard. And so I think of this in the context of devices. So I know a lot of, I'm not the only one who looks at this. I know the medical industry looks at this problem a lot. I know that folks who make equipment look at this problem a lot, but it's the idea that, for any given SBOM, that SBOM may link to one or multiple devices. And in fact, any given device can have, multiple SBOMs that all kind of work together to form some picture of that device. The automobile industry is another good example. And so, despite everyone kind of recognizing this as a problem, and I'm not going to say if folks haven't solved it in isolation in specific instances, but I have yet to see kind of formalization around the idea of how you link all of these artifacts to a product. And so I have seen proposals, I have seen some preliminary work, but I think what the key challenge is for me is coming up with with something that enough folks buy into, that you get some level of consistency and confidence that if I say, hey, you know, I have this product, here's the things linked to it, I have some level of expectation that someone's going to understand my reference to that product, and then B, they'll understand how I'm referring to the artifacts that I link to that. So whether that's VEX, whether that's SBOMs, etc. And this is a really hard problem, right? Because a lot of the ways we refer to products are stochastic, in that depending on kind of what your industry is or what your device is, you may have some variability and conditions that change without iterating on, for example, the product name. And so that actually makes this a really difficult problem.
Yeah, and well, I mean, Lucas noted that this has been, this is definitely not a new problem. It has been tackled in various industries. But as part of that, as part of tackling this problem, everybody has different solutions that meet their requirements for how to do this. So like what is applicable or used by one medical device company is not necessarily going to be applicable or useful to a different medical device company, given the specific device that's being used, given the types and release of software, how they manage that, how they are regulated, all that kind of thing. So this basically means that even if you could start to solve this problem, it's not going to be a one solution that takes care of everything. Everybody's going to be coming up with their own solutions, they're going to have to deal with it in their unique ways. And anybody who's going to be consuming SBOMs has to be able to accommodate all these different ways of handling it. So if I am, a consumer who consumes products from 5 different vendors, and those 5 different vendors have their own ways of managing their own software bombs and mapping those to products, then that means I have to be cognizant of that. And if I'm going to be using those SBOMs for any particular purpose, then I am going to have to be adaptable to all 5 of those different ways. Again, knowing what I can say with one of them versus what I can't say with another, and all that kind of stuff. So this all just kind of, none of these things are individually unsolvable problems, but they all conflate to create really difficult issues that are going to make all this really difficult, which is, I guess, redundant. Difficult issues that are going to make using SBOMs for supply chain risk management difficult. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it or we shouldn't try to do it, but we should be going in with eyes open. And all this leads to our last key challenge, which is on the next slide, which is really like, how do we do this at enterprise scale? If you think of a modern computer, modern Windows operating system, modern Mac OS or Linux, you're talking about like billions of different types of software that are potentially on there that are all take huge organizations of people, sometimes rather structured, sometimes unstructured. But this is a lot of software, and it's constantly changing. And this is for one computer. If we change our scope and we say, okay, well, we don't care about the Windows computers of the world. We only care about certain critical things. Well, that makes it a little bit easier, but you have to decide like how are you going to do that. And if you have 1,500 of a particular type of system, that's 1,500 SBOMs potentially or more, depending on how you handle the fact that software changes and you have updates and all that kind of stuff, and then the variability and all that other kind of stuff that we've been talking about. It becomes a really big problem. I don't know any organization that does asset management perfectly. I think traditionally asset management is always a hard problem. That doesn't mean there aren't tools to help you do it, but just recognizing that it is a hard problem requires a lot of work, a lot of overhead. And similarly in how, like, if you show me a network diagram for an organization, I'm going to show you an incorrect network diagram. That's dealing with software, things that are constantly changing. We're going to have that times orders of magnitude more difficulty than just managing property per se, something that you can physically touch and put a sticker on. We're going to have that with software, which is just kind of insane. Lucas, what else would you add?
Yeah, no, I think one thing that we should acknowledge here is, I guess for those who've been following SBOMs, for me the needle here has been moving. I think what I'm starting to see is especially folks who are producing software are getting closer to a state where not only is it practical at enterprise scale, it's integrated into their their build process, and they're starting to use it effectively. So I think for certain folks, this is today and it's useful now. I'm sure some of those folks are probably in this room and could probably talk about, some pain points they still have. And so for me, I think it's when you start to get towards consumers or aggregators of this information that have a little less control over their generation. I think is where you're going to start to see some of the pain associated with the varying sources, the varying levels of rigor, the differing opinions. And quite honestly, I know for me personally, licensing agreements, and kind of the legal framework that's currently in place for what you can and can't do. So for example, if I get software that maybe is no longer being maintained, and the license agreement says I can't distribute it, well, that's really hard if I want to plug it into a tool that uses a cloud environment outside of my institution. So there's a lot of challenges here, but I think there's good news. So
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point that you made with regards to kind of when we're talking about enterprise scale BOM management, there are instances where you have highly curated, controlled environments or organizations where they can very much and are very much doing this at a very large scale. But that again, once you leave those environments, and especially that type of control, if you are somebody like an organization that is not in charge of all the things that you produce, it gets harder. It gets a lot harder. So that's kind of the distinction and the difference. So those are the 7 primary ones that we've identified. And so the real question is like, well, what's next? And we'll get into that on the next slide. So first, we're definitely open and excited to know, like, do you agree? Are these the right problems? Are we missing any? We have talked about these key challenges with a number of different organizations, asset owners, vendors, groups, industry groups, and kind of said, hey, this is what we think, and we took feedback to that. But this is still like another forum, always wanting to know, like, are these the things that we should be working on? Who else is working on them? We're obviously aware of a lot of work that is being done, especially in some of the other federal agencies, such as DHS, CISA, and other working groups. But that's one of the big things is we have our ears open. We want to know what you think. But then the second is that we're going to be, we're starting to actively work on trying to solve these problems, or at least document and make advances in, improving them. The first 2 that we are actively working on are just kind of the first 2 problems, the most kind of immediate ones that we see. So key challenge number 1, associating that CVE with the product does not mean it's vulnerable. Again, this is not like new information for a lot of people that are in this space, but it is something that is going to be causing a lot of issues with people that are getting into SBOMs or starting to deal with SBOMs and using that for supply chain risk management. So this is really just more a matter of like documenting the process that happens and saying, hey, vulnerability triage, all that kind of stuff, it takes time, helping inform organizations' policies as they start to consider using SBOMs as part of supply chain risk management, so that they don't end up thinking that, okay, this guy is falling, or I've got my new product and has 6,000 vulnerabilities in it. Why are you selling me shoddy products? All that kind of stuff, or wasting time trying to deal with that. So trying to just provide the documentation in a way that is targeted towards the energy sector of saying, hey, this is what it's like. This is what you can expect. This is how you should go about it. Just trying to provide that and make that accessible. And then I'll let Lucas talk about KC2.
Yeah, so KC2 is kind of a work in progress, but the idea that we outlined is we want to kind of explore more thoroughly the interaction between asset owners and OEMs, and so that's a really broad problem, and it requires kind of a lot of specificity. But effectively, what we're trying to put together is a framework that we can kind of test out some models, explore how SBOMs work in that framework, how they compare to existing or traditional vulnerability methods that are in place, maybe how they affect entities that are different sizes or with different capabilities, and then kind of explore, running those to fruition. And you just pretend like, okay, this is the absolute ideal circumstances. Everyone's here that everyone here wants to be here. Everyone's willing to exchange. Everyone wants to make this successful. And then kind of looking at the outcomes of how much did this help us? And if we find out that it's not adding a lot of value under the most ideal scenarios, I think that's cause for some reflection. But maybe we also uncover some efficiencies or models that tended to work better. And so that's the effort we're looking to scope out. And we'll be looking for partners in those activities. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, definitely stay tuned.
And with that, that's what we had to present. So if there are any questions, we'd be happy, or comments or discussion points, we'd be happy to entertain them.
Chris, you want to lead us off?
Sure, why not? So thanks for all that. So I posted in the comments the CISA working group, sharing working group output, one of the artifacts, and the current activity that Quorum is working on is focusing on ISACs. And the energy sector, is always, as I look, from whichever hat I'm wearing, so I'm with SIBs, for transparency as well as everything else I do. The sector you folks focus on, frankly, right? The North American grid and all that implies is an interesting case. And as you just presented there, as you folks know, the Citrix program and the legacy that has, the DOE and all of its partners have been moving down this path at a given rate. And it's an open question. There's like some of the ones you guys put out there, but when and to what stage does it move forward? And I would interested in your thoughts. I am a notorious optimist, but I think the forces driving us down this path, and as you guys have talked about, the artifacts we developed over the last number of years, put us in the space where a given sector could do this surprisingly well in perhaps the next handful of years. Where is your optimism level for the sector sitting after looking closely at the space?
Do you want to go first, Lucas?
I'll let you go first. I'm pulling my thoughts together.
Okay. I'll just shoot from the hip. I think so. I think there's going to be a lot of good that's going to come out of this, and most of that is going to come when people have, again, like eyes wide open. They know what they're going to get out of it. They know what it's good for, and we figured out, like, okay, I've got this SBOM, or I've got an idea of how this SBOM was created or generated, and I know what I can use it for, and I've built that into my overall processes. So basically, moving away from the idea of, okay, SBOM is going to solve your problems, or SBOM is going to do whatever, and actually defining like what that means and what that looks like and in what scenario does it work, and then getting all that ironed down. So as people start to, this is just going to happen naturally. As people actually try to use SBOMs for different things, they're going to figure out like what works, what is trustworthy, what is useful, and for what purpose. And as we start to do that, then it's going to be nothing but good. And so I think, the way that the industry is going with regards to doing supply chain risk management, I think we're getting to that point. We're moving away from, hey, we don't know anything, SBOM will solve the problem, to, hey, we're starting to learn some stuff. SBOM is a tool that can help us get there, but we still have these other problems, or now we have new problems, kind of thing. So I think that's my very hot take.
Yeah, so for me, I actually expect some other industries to kind of move quicker. I think there's some other industries that I could point to that just already had some mechanisms in place to get a lot of the consistency, a lot of the data exchange that was kind of already part of the process, regulations in place to move it forward. So one nice thing is that, and it's a little selfish, I'm hoping some of the industries kind of progress some of these problems forward. And so, for me, I ask a series of questions. So do I think SBOMs are going to be integrated eventually? I do. And I do because I found them personally useful, when we're developing software. And so from that perspective, I think there are some incentives for people to generate them and use them to manage their stuff. With respect to the grid writ large, the question I like to ask is the cost of implementing today better than other, I guess, security investments that you could make? And I don't know that my answer is yes yet. And so to me, that means there's still sort of a cost associated with getting us there. And so I would stop short of recommending that we move forward today. And I would say, it's still kind of up to folks to determine, I guess, how close to the tip of the spear they want to be. I wouldn't recommend it today. I think some of the hurdles that are in place are going to make it prohibitively expensive, and I would rather, when folks finally do get exposed to this, that it's a good experience, and it's an enabler. And I think if you pull the trigger too early, it could have detrimental effects. So,
Well said. Thanks.
Alex.
So first, I would say that I would love if Citrix could give me all of my SBOMs and HBOMs to all of my devices and make my job a whole lot easier. But until then, I was wondering, what do you think the CRA is going to do? So the European Union Cyber Resiliency Act is going to do to supply chain transparency, and is there a thought on whether or not something similar within the US may help, or even North America may help drive some of this supply chain transparency to the next level?
So I guess I'll jump in first. So first of all, I'm familiar, loosely familiar with the CRA. I've looked over it, but I'm anything but an expert. So, take whatever I say with a grain of salt. I actually like a lot of aspects of it. I like a lot of aspects of it in that I think the expectation is for producers of software to start generating these SBOMs and have them. To my knowledge, it doesn't necessarily require you to, broadly share them, and I think that's okay. But the reason I like it is, so I've seen in my experience that there's certain pockets of, industry that are more resistant to this idea, and I think something like that will kind of nudge them over the edge and encourage them to start at least doing it institutionally. So from that perspective, I think it's positive. When we talk about sharing, that's I would punt responding to that for a little longer, right? I'd like to see a few more success stories of what exchanges look like and kind of what the true value of providing kind of the complete information. Because to the point earlier, it may never make sense to have that information passed downstream if, the onus is on the creator to maintain and monitor. So I don't know if I have a good answer for that yet.
Then I'll just add that, so I have not looked directly at the CRA, but of course you have, and this may not be applicable because it might be a carve out for it. So just caveating with that. But people who produce open source software, they're vendors of software, they develop stuff, they usually do it for fun, not out of obligation. And of course, it's a global thing. So there's limitations to what can and cannot be said about, what is in software as a whole. I think it's going to be, it's a net good because we'll know more than we did, but there's still going to be limitations overall to what is knowable and what is not knowable. Again, potentially really effective tool, but there's going to be limitations. It doesn't solve the problems. It just helps us along the way. And I guess we'll go with Matthew.
Yeah, so first, thank you. This is my first time attending, so I definitely appreciate all the work. Been following SBOMs for a long time. But my question, and also happy to hear about the substation work that was going on there with Alex. The question is around, here we talked about SBOMs. We didn't really cover HBOMs. I know that's a whole other level of detail and challenges. But the vision question, and I want to build on Chris's point a little bit, is how far do you think we are from not just individual OEM SBOMs, but the system-based application of SBOMs. And so, OEMs working together and sharing different interactions. So for instance, a few months ago, somebody came to me and said, well, what about cloud bombs or network bombs, or all these different types of bombs? We've all heard all of them, whatever they are, but that first letter that fits in there. But what about like the system SBOM, which the example is there for the substation? When can we get those, let's say, for an entire manufacturing system or an entire capability? Do you see OEMs working together at all?
So I think probably, I mean, to be by strict definition, it would be trivial to do, because I have my SBOM, Lucas has his SBOM. We say, hey, we're going to build a system together. We combine the SBOMs and we're done. But that doesn't mean, again, that those SBOMs were developed to the same quality, to the same objectives, with the same types of schemes in terms of naming things or organizing information or depth or anything else like that. And that might not be just because we're following different guidelines. It could be just because we have fundamentally different technologies. So again, like if I'm writing a product that consists primarily of text files like Python scripts, that's going to look different from somebody who's doing a web application, which is going to look different from somebody who's compiling C code versus Golang versus Rust versus low-level UEFI stuff. There's all these different niches that make up these systems that have to be handled differently in terms of thinking about like, what is software? How do we document what software is? How does that software change over time? So I think, again, like kind of trivially, it's very, very doable in terms of understanding what the differences are and how we handle all these niche instances that ultimately make up the computer systems that we use and rely on, especially when we combine them. That's going to have some significant effects on what we can actually do with a system SBOM, or what types of things we can say, or how uniform it is. So it gets kind of into that uniformity or heterogeneity of SBOMs. So I think we can do it, but we're not going to be sure as to what we can do with that information yet, and that might take some more work. What would you add, Lucas?
Yeah, so I'll divide the problem a bit. So if I'm a producer of a product or a software and I have dependencies on kind of other OEMs, I do expect to see greater continuity there, right? Because if I as an OEM want to release my SBOM, well, I want to know what's in my stuff. I buy some stuff, so I want to know what's in their stuff. And so I expect that there's some natural incentives for that model for it to happen naturally. If we're talking about systems across OEMs that are kind of otherwise disconnected, where you may be reliant on the operator to build and maintain that, it's not obvious to me what incentives there would be for the OEMs to work together. I just don't know what would drive that model. But almost certainly there's OEMs in the room and around that probably have a better answer.
Well, that was good. I appreciate it. It sounds like we're at the right direction. So thank you very much.
Yeah, one thing I'll share. So I sat in on a working group that was attempting to formalize kind of some of the data structures and concepts around systems, and it didn't go well. Right. I think where we kind of landed was there was this original idea for a product BOM, and we didn't get much further than that. And then in the meantime, the folks who rely on that requiring that kind of structure have just been running with their own thing in the meantime. So I certainly haven't seen continuity around what I'll call an envelope for systems yet.
Cool. I think with that, Catherine, I believe we're at time.
So thank you, Lucas and Robert, for hosting such a great presentation and discussion, and thank you all for attending. We really want to engage with industry as kind of what's going on within the field is incredibly relevant, and we want that to guide the research that we're doing here at the labs. I will follow up with contact information if you would like to follow up with any feedback for us all in an email later this afternoon, as well as additional information on kind of where and potentially when to expect those slides and meeting recordings. So yeah, thank you all very much and have a great day.